As I walk now along the southern perimeter of the Mission Quadrangle, we're going to go down and take a look at an area that was presently is outside of the ownership of the mission itself. Was mission land that was sold over the years since the mission lands were restored to the church by Abraham Lincoln in 1861. Still proceeding along the southwest corner of the Mission Quadrangle, you will have seen the very high rise, as it were, a small hill, which is the western and southern corner of the Mission Quadrangle, and also the area which is directly south of there, and the present Mission gates, which are the main entrance to the Mission from the city of Solvang. These gates only date to approximately 1974, the first ones being a solid wood panel gate, and at later time, in about 1990, these gates were reconstructed into a much sturdier form of steel. As we go outside the gates, we are going to be able to take a look at a piece of the property that once belonged to the mission and is no longer within our possession, but over which we have had a constant influence, in as much as underneath these areas are many of the other mission ruins. Where I am standing now is directly behind the what we call the Sheraton Hotel, which is built on property, approximately 3 acres of property, which was sold to a private concern in 1978. The history of this particular area is quite controversial. It was sold by the Archdiocese to a group of 5 owners here in the valley who wanted to develop the hotel. However, when the sale took place, I noticed that in the financial statement in regard to the value of the property and the amount of money that it was sold for, that I went to Father Roger and I told him that I thought this price was way below the true value of the property. Being a very astute businessman that he was, he immediately contacted the Archdiocese, and he also contacted a man here in the valley whose name was Tom Dobbins. He owned a motel on the other end of town. He researched the value of the property and found that this amount of property was worth 3 times as much as it's for which it was paid. In the end, it resulted in a lawsuit, primarily because of what happened at the archdiocesan level. There was a man working in the real estate department of the archdiocese named Purcell, and it turned out that Mr. Purcell was also a member of the group of 5 that had purchased this property for the hotel. Immediately, Monsignor Hawks, who was the chancellor of the archdiocese, filed a lawsuit against the group. It went to court, and the contract was nullified. The property then sat loose for approximately about a year, at which time this group assembled again, of course, excluding Mr. Purcell, a group of 4, and they repurchased the land under a new contract for over $1 million, which was the true value of the property. In fact, the original price, the new price, was $1.1 million, and at that time the hotel was built. Later on, this property would again become controversial, not so much because of the hotel itself, but because of something that was done during the building of the hotel, and that was a temporary easement given to the builders of the hotel to use the driveway between the post office and the windmill as an access for service trucks while the buildings were built. The owners of the hotel let this easement stand. The archdiocese did not cancel it when the buildings were done, and at a later date, when the dispute arose in regard to the post office, which we will talk about in a few moments, came up, this easement became of a vital importance, and again, the mission had to go to court in order to settle the dispute. We are now standing in the area that is almost adjacent, north of the Sheraton Hotel. It is a post office. It was also on property that belonged to the Old Mission and was sold to a man, or rather not sold, but leased to a man named Walter Duff in the very early 50s. Mr. Duff, and then in turn, having taken a 50 or 40-year lease on the property, proceeded to build a post office for the postal department, and for which the mission received $1 a year in lease, plus the payment of the taxes on this particular property. And the mission owned, Mr. Duff owned this property until the approximately the early 80s, at which time Mr. Duff died, and also his wife Gertrude died. And at that time, they willed the property back to the mission for an exchange of $15,000. This property also came in under controversy again at a much later date, namely around the late 1990s, 98 or 99, when it turned out that the mission decided that it would like to get a better return from the post office for the lease on this property, which was a very small lease. At that time, in the part of negotiating with the post office department, some problems of easements were discovered. It was discovered that the easements allowing the traffic passing between next to the post office were also controlled by the owners of the Sheraton. Those leases that I spoke about earlier were found to be still in effect. And in order to gain back a full access and to get a better control of the post office property, it was found necessary to renegotiate this area of the mission. And as a result, the mission literally had to buy back its own property from the Sheraton Group for approximately $100,000. But at last that area had been cleared up. The area of the leases on the post office are now cleared up, and the full lease on the post office will expire around 2012, at which time the post office, the entire area will have to be renegotiated. But we do have full control over the area that comes through between the post office and the windmill. Now we're going to turn around directly behind the post office here, moving towards the north, and we will take a look at the area which also was at one time under the ownership of the mission. Moving further northward, we are now standing in the exact middle of what was the original mission threshing floor. It was out here that the grains and stuff were threshed by the use of the mules, and also by the floor, which is approximately a foot underneath the asphalt here, and it was uncovered at the time the buildings and this parking lot was installed. The threshing floor is a rock floor which was very much intact in various spots around. Also, as we pan around this area from the threshing floor, you will see the various shops and buildings which were once part of the mission property and were farmed by the mission until around 1950, at which time various portions of this land were sold off, so that we now have 5 different owners and 5 different shops that are no longer in the ownership of the mission. Also, as we come around, you are going to notice the large slumpstone wall. This wall was built in 1974 as part of the restoration of the mission under the guidance of Father Roger Anderson. This wall is just probably 5 or 6 feet just west or on the outside of the original mission quadrangle. The area along the wall, 20 feet of that was retained during the sale of the other property in 1950 for an easement and right-of-way into the mission, so that from this end there would always be access to the mission. After this lot was paved, the mission leased the land between the wall and the 30 feet out to the city to the various owners of these buildings. And it was established to be a bus parking area, and it is that till today. However, in 1980, the 30 feet of the ground here was sold to the various owners of the shops here towards Solvang, and was sold to these owners and is no longer in control of the mission. However, the passageway between the bus parking lot and where the cars are stored now still has an easement, which gives us permanent access to the mission, both at the gate, the main gate to the mission, and also at the smaller service entrance, which is north of here. The first piece of property that was sold was the property you see with the very high-peaked roof here, and it's probably, in its time, will become an historical element in the city of Solvang. It is the location of the first Burkholm's Bakery, which is part of the early history of the city of Solvang and the Santa Inés Valley. It is now owned by a different family, the Halmy family, but Carl Burkholm and his family owned and managed that bakery for many, many years. The property itself was bought from the church by Raymond Paskey, who first of all developed the bakery and sold it to the Burkholm family, and later on the various pieces of property down here he sold off. At the first few years he farmed them. Later on he built his own, the first mortuary in the city along this property, and it stayed there probably till around 1960 when Mr. Paskey closed his business. As we look further on down towards the north, we will be looking out towards Highway 246 and the city parking lot number 1, which is quite an interesting history as far as the mission is concerned, and involves another legal problem over which the mission had to fight for its rights. It seems that most of the different developments of property here at the mission that are outside the quadrangle have always been involved in some kind of a financial controversy, mostly because the land was so valuable, and it was thought that perhaps this property could be taken from the mission for a song instead of paying the full price of the mission. So we'll now go over towards the parking lot number 1. I'm standing now in the center of what is called a parking lot number 1, belonging to the city of Solvang. It was originally, up until around 1960, still within the ownership of the Old Mission, and was farmed together with the meadow in front of the mission by Ines Olson. In 1960, a parking district was established here in Solvang because of the increased tourism. And one of the pieces of property which the city wanted very badly because of its close proximity to Copenhagen and Alisau Road, which is the center of Solvang, was this piece of property. And consequently, feeling that because of the necessity for this property to the community, that it could fall under the laws of eminent domain. And as a result, the city of Solvang condemned the property for eminent domain and made an offer to the, and settled on a price with the mission on their own without consulting the mission, and proceeded to take possession of the land. However, it was also discovered in the same thing as it happened at the Sheraton, that this property was much greater value than was put upon it by the appraisers. And again, the Archdiocese was forced to go to court and to get a judgment from a judge that the appraisal on that property was incorrect, that a new appraisal should be made, and that should be based on the current evaluation of property within the area. And as a result, the mission again was saved from a substantial financial loss by taking this matter to court. The parking lot was then developed, and part of the agreement was that between the parking lot and the mission, a wall was to be built, and also that an entrance and an arch was also to be established so that there would be permanently foot traffic available to people in town, to the mission itself. And consequently, part of the agreement, the financial agreement, was that also this mission arch entranceway was to be built and maintained by the city, so that there would be permanent access from the downtown area to the mission itself. This all was done under the leadership of Father Camillus McCrory, who was the pastor at that time. Later on, a controversy arose over the easement, the walking easement into the mission, which was simply marked by white lines and some occasional steel pole. And it turned out to be that this was a very unsafe area because of the parking lot, and it was again gone back to the city, and they were forced to establish a better easement and access to the mission. And for that, and at that time, a raised area was put in, and a brick walk, which has definitely improved the west entrance to the old mission. We are now at the far north end of parking lot number 1, and we're standing on property which had originally belonged to the mission, like the other parts of the property, and were sold to a developer to be used for the, at that time, the Security National Bank. This happened around 1970, and the bank built their property here. There was no controversy over this property. It was handled at the market value, and has been an asset in that sense to the city of Solvang. However, the area that we are standing on until that time was farmed, together with the front meadow and parking lot number 1 were farmed by Ines Olsen for many years, and was a very natural scene here in the city of Solvang. As part of the sale and development of this property, an arch was also built so that we were guaranteed foot traffic entrance to the mission via this archway. The wall itself dates to a later time, probably around 1978. At that time, the grape stake fence, which ran between the state highway and here, was taken down, together with the other part of the arch over here. The grape stake fence was removed, and the slump stone wall was built. Now, as we complete our circle of the mission, we walk towards and through the arch, which is a footpath into the old mission. As I walk along here, I might also note, for technical reasons, that directly to my right here is the main sewer line from the old mission. So all the waste from the old mission itself, excluding the new buildings, passes through this sewer area here to a manhole which is at the on Alisal Road. Now, as we walk towards the The mission, we will go to the arch, which was built and established for us by the city of Solvang, and is a heavily traveled area for the mission from foot traffic from the downtown area of Solvang. So from here on out, we will now be taking a better and closer look at the mission itself. We have now entered into the inside of the mission itself, inside the mission grounds, as it were, and along the path from under the arch, and we will be moving back out into the meltdown part of the old quadrangle. This walk was established directly after the establishment of the arch, and has been in constant use by the foot traffic from downtown since then. As we move back into the inner circle, or the inside of the mission quadrangle, we are now walking over part of the meltdown in this rise, which you see here before you. Looking forward there, you see what is now the service entrance to the mission. It was at one time, after the mission period, the main entrance into the mission itself. Car traffic, etc., used this gate. It is now a private entrance used for service only. Also, the main water supply from the mission at that time, this would be up until 1974, came in from the city of Solvang, from Alisal Road, and moved directly across here under the asphalt and up to the mission buildings themselves. To my left, we are able to see some of the rise that we saw from the other side of the mission quadrangle. As we walk along the service and tourist entrance to the mission now from the city of Solvang, the first building that we come upon is this small building. This building has quite a history. It was built in 1906 or 8 by Father Buckler. He had at that time bought an automobile. He didn't have any place to put it, and consequently as a result, he built himself a garage in this area here. And that served as the garage area for Father Buckler until he left. At that time, the buildings were abandoned for a number of years until sometime in the late 40s. At that time, two people came to live here at the mission. One of them was Brother Alexis, who was a member of the Capuchin order. He was not a priest, but he was a member of the order, and he did more of the grounds work and other work around the mission itself. He was a great carpenter, and at that time he created inside this building a up-to-date carpenter shop, and in this carpenter shop he built many of the pews that were in the church at that time. He also built many of the kneelers that are still used in the mission. Shortly thereafter, a gentleman who worked on the dairies used to come in here and would work and help Brother clean up the gardens and prune the hedges and bushes and that type of thing. When the dairy closed, he had no place to live, but he was spending most of his time here at the mission, helping out in the gardens. His name was John Gebhard, and he had quite a history here at the mission. At that time, Father Tim decided, well, since he was working so much time here at the mission, that it would be great if he had a place to live. But there was a conflict. Brother Alexis had his shops in this building, so it was decided in a compromise that the building would be divided into two parts. The part the furthest up this way would become Brother's carpenter shop, and the section on this lower area here would become what we called Old John's house. And John moved in there and lived there clear up to about 1994, at which time he was found dead one morning, lying on his bed here. But he was quite a character. And we will talk about him later when we get into the mission gardens. But he lived in this area, and it was nowhere quite as elaborate as it was. This was just a large area that he had fenced in, and he kept his chickens here. And also behind this area here that is now occupied by this small storage building, there was a tremendous eucalyptus tree, which had a probably a width of almost 8 foot. And I do not know how high it was, but it was extremely high. And in the early 1990s, this tree became a hazard. Quite often, the branches would break and fall to the ground out over the footpath here, and also over the area that we're going to look at next, which are the public restrooms and the garages. So it was decided that the only way to properly treat this tree was to remove it. And so it was removed at that time, and the wood had to be destroyed because it was so brittle and hard that it couldn't even be split. So he was taken onto a lower area of the mission, and it was buried in the ground there to decay. After old John died, this building became a retirement home for Father Tim, who had been the pastor here at one time. And during the administration of Father Cyril, Father Tim retired. He was serving at the state home in Bakersfield as a government employee, chaplain at the home there. He retired, and he did not, he was, at that time, the Capuchins would retire in their old age at San Lorenzo. He preferred to stay here, which was a kind of the love of his life. He had spent much of his time, we'll talk about him later, here at the mission. And so Father Cyril asked the men's club to totally remodel this building, which we did. The roof was removed. The interior of the building was totally taken down and restored with knotty pine and paneling. The outside of the building was stuccoed. A new roof was put on using the old tiles. And Father Tim lived up there until just recently, here at the turn of the century, when he passed away almost at 100 years old. After he had passed away, the building was then converted into the growing needs of Mission Santa Inés. In this particular case, the need for a youth center. And so this building was again remodeled and was created our St. Francis Center, and a small office at the far end of the building for the groundskeeper here at the mission. Just next to and east of Old John's house that we'll refer to here was built as the public restrooms for the tourists that were taking tours in the garden, and also under Father Tim's direction at the time the school was built. Also, these garages were established. There were actually 3 garages at that particular time. The one in the middle has been filled in and is used for an office at the present time. But there were 3 garages established here, one for the brother and one for the priest, and then one for a visiting priest. Father Tim had a wonderful appreciation of the historicity of the mission, and you can see the tremendous effort and design and thought that went into the building of this garage, so that it kept the old mission flavor here with the tile roof, and many of the tiles that were on the mission that had deteriorated over the years or fallen off of the buildings were saved and were placed here, and they are preserved in that way for the future. The garage itself is quite a project, and is something we can really be proud of in view of the very simplicity of the building, that it's nothing really more than a place to park cars. But it does make part of a very nice entrance into the mission for foot traffic. As we approach the youth center, we're going to take a few moments to take a look at the shop area. Until 1968, there was no area here at the mission in which any tools or anything could be stored. There was a small garage here that we spoke about before, and a few tools were able to be kept in there. However, in 1968 to 1972, with the aid of the men's club, and particularly the work of George Stanton and Dennis Perry, the shop area was constructed. It consists of 3 buildings built over the course of 2 years and a concrete slab. We'll now go into the shop area and just get a brief view of what goes to make up the maintenance section of Old Mission Santa Inés. This is the shop area. I will draw your attention first of all to the concrete slab. This concrete slab was poured in one Saturday by the actual work of the men's club, and also the material and everything that pertained to this slab was paid for by the Mission Men's Club as a result of their different activities, their dinner dances, and part of their fiesta money. Also, after the slab was poured, we were able to construct 3 buildings. One building which houses the small tools and is some storage. At the far end is a building that meets it and goes across this way. And that building was constructed primarily to store all the booths and anything that had to do with our annual fiesta. It is no longer used for that because the booths have changed. However, it is still an area that is available for the shop. Some of the power tools and also the storage of the machinery and lawnmowers, etc., are stored in this part of the shed. So, in the summary, this part of the work area was constructed first. A year later, this area that we're looking at right now was constructed. Later on, the 2 buildings were connected by another building, and after that, in about the year 2000, the roof connected the 2 buildings together. The area that I'm standing in now, although it appears to be a service area because of the utility box and the television connections and telephone things in the ground, but this area served a very important part of the history of the mission during the time of Father Roger and Father Kelly, and somewhat into the time of Father Cyril. Brother Patrick came here shortly after the arrival of Father Kelly, and much like another brother that was here much earlier, he loved gardening, and this area was quite blank, and at that time he turned this into a very beautiful garden, not only of flowers and bushes and shrubs, but also of flowers, and it was quite attractive. People used to stop and marvel at this particular area. When Brother passed away, there was no one to care for it, and the result was that it was merely included as part of the meadow that is out here, and it is nothing more than a real service area at the present time. We are now standing at the west side of the new addition to the mission, the restoration of the mission, which took place in the 1980s. At this particular point is the juncture of the old building and the new building. So half of this arch is in the old building and half of this arch is in the new building. The area that is over here we will discuss later when we get into the gardens, etc. As I move along here between this arch and this arch, before this building was constructed, it was the main road around the end of the mission. We talked about the main road coming into the mission from the west, being down in this direction. Well, it continued on and went directly through here and out to the front of the mission. The rest of this area occupied the ruins of the buildings that we talked about that are now preserved under the new buildings. And as we walk along here, we can see that there is not much to be done here in the line of historical reconstruction, except the fact that to create the effect of the second story on the mission, it was also at that time necessary to install some public restrooms. They were done in this part of the building. But the overall general appearance, together with the balcony, are not true faithful to the mission period. In the wall below the, just outside the kitchen and closer to the back gate of the mission, there is a small valve in the wall. And the purpose of this is to acknowledge its presence, because should anyone turn this valve, the water will flow through it. But it also, at the same time, it will set off alarms at a central office in Washington, D.C., which monitors our fire safety system. And once a flow of water is showed, that the local fire departments are respond because there is a flow of water in the sprinkler system. It sets off, it gives them the communication that there is a fire in the building, and they respond. And we have had this happen at least once in the past by someone actually turning that valve, and we had 8 or 9 fire trucks showing up here responding to a fire situation when there was no fire situation. We have again returned to the front of the mission, and we are going to take a look at the mission from a whole new perspective, namely, what does it look like from the mission itself, looking out on the area, a very beautiful native area that surrounds the mission. The area that we are looking at extends out towards the Santa Inés River and clear over as far as Refugio Road. These were all part of the mission lands at one time, and from this area the mission ran its cattle and sheep, and also its vegetables and trees, orchards, and all things of this particular nature. The area that's directly in front of us here, as I said before, is part of the original El Camino Real, coming down out of the Alisal and entering out towards what is now Highway 246. The area down below the mission here that is of such a beautiful nature, and of which many, many thousands of our guests here each year are totally impressed by the view that they get once they have entered the mission grounds. It is totally isolated. It still maintains the original view. This is the view that was there when the mission, outside of a few changes here and there, this is the view that the Padres saw when they established the mission. This was a place they put the mission on the hill so that it would stand out for the local Chumash as a center of their valley. It was close to the river where there was a water supply, and it was also close and surrounded by very fertile land. Over the years, there have been many, many attempts to take away this view which belongs to the mission. The latest attempt was during the mid-1980s when it was decided to create a traffic element for the city of Solvang in order to relieve some of the traffic. And part of that solution was to take a road from Alisal Road on the which would be the south end of the mission, and run it across this field, so that looking out here at the present time, had that plan succeeded, a road, a 4-lane highway would have went out in front of the mission, completely destroying the natural effect that we have in the mission. And of course, the next effect of that would be wherever a road goes, there also comes development. And perhaps by this time, or very close to this time, we would have had housing or commercial areas or whatever. And consequently, a group of us here at the mission formed a committee called the Sunny Fields Committee. And we fought this thing very strongly for 4 years before the city, before the county, and before every public entity that we could in order to stop this thing. We were not being very successful until we were able to force the city to put this measure on the ballot. And it was on that time, putting this measure on the ballot, that I think the entire legal departments of our city realized how important this area was, because it was one of the largest votes that ever took place here in the valley. 75% of the people who voted to preserve this area, and thus the mission was preserved, and that this is out of the general plan now. And the future of this field is very promising, because now, in union with the Santa Barbara Trust for Historical Preservation, who own the land that is at the far end of this field below, we are joined together, and together with the state of California, and probably by 2010, this entire area will be dedicated as a state park. It will have an interpretive area, we'll have trees and pathways and orchards and everything, so that for the future, this native natural view will be preserved. And we are very proud of the accomplishments that we have done in this regard, because especially under the administration of Father Jim Cleary, who led this Sunnyfields battle and gave his full support and the support of the Archdiocese to preserving this area. And so we are very proud of that accomplishment, and we are sure that the residents of California and the United States will be able to appreciate this view for at least another century. Before we leave this part of the second floor of the mission, I just want to draw your attention to the portion of the new building, which begins at this area right here and extends down there for the number of arches that we discussed before. It is of similar nature, not quite identical to the porch that we're on now, but it does still recreate the necessary effect of the building as it was built by the Padres in 1804. We are again back at the western side of the quadrangle of the Old Mission, and as you will recall, we were taking a look at the old John's house and also the garages in this area here. We are also standing right at the spot where the old mission quadrangle ended, and the new additions from the 1980s were built. As we move in the direction down towards the old quadrangle, we will be getting our first view of the mission gardens, which were part of the mission in the early period. You're now looking at another view of the garages from their west exposure. At the time the garages were built, also a small wall and a small private garden was established at that time. We called it the Padres Garden. It is not used too much. In the 1970s, we did have some parochial parties in the area. The parish was much smaller than it is now, and we were able to put up a tent or a few things and have a garden party. But at the present time, it's still a private garden, and is there for different activities that we have here at the mission. As we move to the right, you are going to get your first glimpses of the mission gardens that were established here in 1924. They are built, these gardens exist on top of the, what was a part of the original quadrangle. And the area that we see in gardens now was most likely an area for the use of shops and different mission activities of the mission period. The mission gardens that you are now looking at are not as I said before, are not part of the original Padres time of the missions. These gardens were established here in 1924, and there's a very interesting story behind the establishment of these gardens. During the period of 1924 and 1932, when the Capuchin Fathers came here, one of the brothers that was sent here was a brother named Father Columkill. And Brother Columkill, rather. And Brother Columkill was here to assist the priest. He acted as a housekeeper and a cook, and someone that did some of the necessary things around the mission. Well, it was a very difficult time, and as a result, Brother Columkill was not extremely happy with being stationed here, having been in many better assignments that perhaps almost every parish that he had worked in with the Capuchins at least had an inside bathroom. At this particular mission, we only had outhouses, so his whole life was complicated, and he tried to find a way in order to, in some way, pass the time until he was changed from here. And as a result, the result of that was these gardens. That every day after he had given the priest the noonday meal, he disappeared here in the gardens, and in the process of that, he established what we see in the gardens now. If you will notice, the basic design of the garden is in the form of a Celtic cross. That is a cross with a circle in the middle and a fountain in the center. This was all planted sometime after 1924, before 1932, by Brother Columkill. Inside of each square, he planted shrubs and plants, a lot of plumbago, a lot of pyracantha, and other colorful flowers. And this was, and this garden area has remained a tribute to Brother Columbkill since that time. The area that actually consisted of the garden area that Brother Columbkill developed is an area that begins at the end of the church, which about is where the date palm is on the corner, and running across on a straight line to meet the garages. That was the size of the original garden, and it remained that size until 1970, when the gardens were increased, enlarged, and developed also. We've now returned to the ground floor, and I'm walking along the part of the original convento. This part of the convento dates to the beginnings of its building in 1804. The arches that you see are original arches. The original tiles, original bricks, the original arches are all as they were laid out by the Padres in 1804 when this mission was being built. As I move towards the church itself, you can also see the arches themselves. You can also see the outlines of windows and doors, which are pretty much in place, the same place that they were at the time of the Padres. The only thing that would be different would be the concrete floors on which I'm walking. Most likely they were originally tiles, but at the present time, in 1924, before 1924, when Father Buckler was here, he did see to it that a certain amount of concrete work was done. And one of those things was, first of all, to concrete the floor area in here, and also on this side here, because of the heavy rains that collected in the gardens, he also built these small little dams, as it were, between the arches, and the purpose of them was to keep the dirt, to keep the moisture, the water, etc., from coming in on the buildings. So Father Buckler early realized that water and adobe did not mix well, and consequently he did very many projects to preserve the mission from the damages of water. As I walk down towards the cross on the wall here, the last door will be the entrance to the mission church. It also will have been the entrance to the original choir loft, which we will see later in the church, and it's through there that those who were studying for the priesthood at the first seminary in California, which we will also talk about later, used to enter the church and go to the choir loft where they said their prayers. Also, I don't know if they'll be able to pick it up on the between the beams above. There will be able, you will see there are wires stretched about every 6 inches. But if they are not able to be seen, I'll tell you that they are up there for a purpose because of a problem that we had here in the mission for many, many years in the summer, and that was with bats. And we found out that by stretching these wires across the beams, that the bats no longer found it comfortable to hang from the beams, and as a consequence, the pavement was preserved from a constant supply of bat dung every morning. This area at the present time, even though it appears to be a storage area, is what is called the Padres Garden. And at different times of the year it looks quite well in here, but in the present time it's being used during the restoration of the church. But the reason we're in here is I just want to draw the attention to the fact that the area I'm about to step on right here is also the location of either a septic tank or a cistern. We're not sure, but it is made of wood. About 30 years ago, I was working out in here in the garden to cut a hole in this wall, and this area that I'm standing in here collapsed. And it turned out to be a dry hole. We're not sure exactly what was in there, but it's made of redwood. It had a redwood cap on it, and the redwood cap was totally deteriorated. The walls seemed to be in good shape, so we made a new redwood cap, placed it over the well, and put the grass back in. So at a later date, in case anyone is wondering, or just for historical marking, we're noting this particular place. There is one other cistern located in the garden, and we're going to take a look at it right now before we conclude this tour. We now have arrived back on the ground level of the mission garden, and this is another perspective of the mission garden. You can see the boxwood hedges planted by Brother Columbkill. The fountain that we are looking at right now is not the original fountain that Brother Columbkill built here. It was made of stone, and In 1974, when the major restoration work took place under Father Roger Anderson, it was found necessary to replace the fountain with a more elaborate kind of fountain, which is not necessarily a mission, but a fountain does belong in this area. The fountain itself, which you can see here, was purchased out of a mansion on Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles and was hauled and installed up here. So it is not really mission, but it does look very pretty here in the mission garden itself. As I walk down towards the church itself, I want to draw your attention to the mission doors. Those are the original mission doors. In them you can see what is called the River of Life, which we will talk about later. Those doors date to at least 1812, 1817 at the very latest, and they have been preserved up to this time by careful oiling and sealing of the wood because of the high heat and exposure to the moisture and dampness of the weather on this particular side of the mission. As I walk down through the Celtic cross here, you will be able to see other parts of the garden. The palm trees that are in here now, there is a blue Guadalupe palm up there. That palm, I don't know how long it's here, but I know that it was here probably in 1930. There are pictures of it when it was very small. The other palms here and all the other palms that might be scattered about the garden, I planted myself here. They came from an old motel down on 5th Street, and we dug them up and planted them here in the gardens, and they were very small, only maybe 2 or 3 feet when they were planted. Over to the right is a magnolia tree, which were given to me by my children on my 25th anniversary here at the mission, and they planted it there, and I've taken very good care of it over the years. As we move down in this direction, away from the fountain itself, we're going to come to what was the far west extent of the mission during the period of 1924 and 1974. So I'm going to point out the area where the mission gardens ended at that particular time, and that is right at this area here. Drawing your attention again from a different perspective, this is Father Jimeno, the remains of Father Jimeno's wall, which we talked about being established in 1835 by Father Joaquin Jimeno. As you can see, we've been able to retain and preserve this much of the wall, although it did run completely up to the mission church. As we walk down along this way, we are now entering the area of the new gardens, which were added in 1974 to 1978, which almost doubled the size, or more than doubled size, of the original mission gardens. The area in which I'm now standing is part of the new gardens here at the Old Mission. There are a number of things in this area, which include the ruins of the original seminary in California, the Our Lady of Lourdes shrine at the far end, and also the area which goes by the name of our Campo Santo, which is the Mission Cemetery. In this area we have the orchards and the grape arbor, and all these things were added except for the grotto in about 1976. The garden extends much further on down this way, and later on, in a few minutes in fact, we will get a good look at another shrine which has been established here in memory of the Capuchin brothers who served here at the mission between 1924 and 1985. As we look at this section of the garden, approximately where we can see this small tree growing and a little bit to this direction is located a cistern. As we talked about before, in Father Buckler's time, he found it necessary to put rain gutters on the building. but in order to collect some of the water here at the mission, he had a cistern dug, and it is located in this area. It is made of brick with a concrete cap on it. We have never opened it up, but we do know that it contained probably around 100 gallons of water. The original fountain that was here at the mission was not circulated water, and it was under a constant drip, and the overflow on this ran under here and ran into the cistern. Quite often, if the water ran too long at any one time, the cistern would fill up and would flow over into this garden. At the present time, it's totally abandoned, but it should be noted that it is located in this particular area. It dates to the time of Father Buckler, and it was connected to the rain gutter system on the building. We must remember that the roof line came down over the top of these arches, and water was collected in the rain gutters. It ran this way and dropped into this cistern. At the present time, the gardens are drained by a very large drainage system, which begins with the downspouts on the building here. They run underground. There is a 10-inch water line that runs under here completely out to Alisal Road, and it is a drainage system from the roofs of the buildings during the stormy weather. We have just left the area of the original gardens of the mission, that garden established by Brother Columkill. We are now into an area that increased enlargement of the garden in 1974 to 1978. The area that we are standing in is close by to the ruins of the old seminary, the first seminary here in California. It was run by the missionaries attached to the mission, and it was established in 1835, was built on this site here, and the ruins are totally intact as far as the floors are concerned underneath. In a few moments we'll walk over, and we do have a portion of the floor that is exposed, and it was the first use of asphalt for flooring and pavement in California, here at Old Mission Santa Inés, and it was used in the bottom floor of the seminary. The seminary was a two-story structure, and it ran from this direction here, and it ran all the way up here to where you can maybe see in the background the grotto to Our Lady of Lourdes. We are now standing over an exposed part of the flooring of this first seminary in California. The name of the college and seminary was Our Lady Refuge of Sinners. And it is from this name here that some portions of this valley have been renamed. For example, the Refugio Pass and the Refugio Road are in memory of the seminary that was here in California. As you look at the floor, as you look at the asphalt floor, you will see the asphalt in a very deteriorated stage, and this is a perfect example of why, in most cases, ruins of historical buildings are not exposed and left in full exposure to the environment. The ruins are so old that they do decay, and we can see here that the asphalt is gradually cracked and broken, but we have left this one part in order to give an idea of the type of construction, floor construction, that was used here at the seminary. The balance of this entire area that we are looking at here now, past the trees to the bench at the end there, was a seminary area with two-story building, as I said before. And it housed those young men, both from Santa Barbara and, in fact, the whole mission system that showed a desire to become Franciscans, priests. The seminary, we do not know how many students that it had at any one time, but we do know that no students ever graduated from this seminary and were ordained, primarily because of the secularization at which in 1835 the mission grounds were removed from the control of the padres, and as a consequence the seminary was closed here. A small boys' school was opened on Refugio Road, and the seminary was moved to the Mission Santa Barbara, where it existed until just a few years ago. We're now going to move towards the west end of the quadrangle here at the mission. The seminary that we have just talked about was entirely within the confines of the mission quadrangle. And the area that we are now approaching is another part of that quadrangle. In a few moments we will see the corner buttress, the ruins of the corner buttress of that end of the quadrangle. As we move to the west end of the quadrangle, I draw your attention to the walks that are in this area. The Spanish stone concrete walks with the tile. These walks were paid for and installed by the Mission Men's Club in 1980. In the latter part of 1980, under the pastorate of Father Cyril, it was decided that we should at some time in the present pay some attention and tribute to the Capuchin brothers who served the mission from 1924 till 1980. And as a result, a little shrine of St. Francis and the Wolf, which is an interesting story in itself, was built by a man named Dennis Perry, and we designed it and he built it, and it has been frequently visited by our visitors here to the mission. It is dedicated to the memory of Brother Collinkill, Brother Conrad, Brother Patrick, Brother Alexius, Brother Brendan, and these were brothers that served the mission between 1924 and 1980. The last brother to serve here was Brother Patrick, and he passed away while he was here, and the system of brothers within the Capuchin order has not been carried on so that brothers can be reassigned here to the mission. As we move from here, we're going to move down and see the corner buttress of the mission, which would be the northwest buttress of the mission. And it is but a ruin, but we will find the interesting story of Pasquala told for us at that particular end of the mission. As we stand at this northwest corner of the mission quadrangle, you will notice that we have here a large formation of rocks. These formation of rocks and limestone plaster formed the corner buttress of this end of the quadrangle. And this is all that we have remaining. The rest of the buildings have melted and they lie within here. However, we do, as you look about here, we do have the area of this corner outlined, and some of the foundation stones of that corner are shown here in this more or less nothing much more than a display of the corner of the quadrangle. But looking over to my right here, you will also notice that there is a small interpretive sign. This sign recalls a very old tradition, a very old, probably a myth about what happened at the mission. It is the story of Pasquala and how she saved the mission from being destroyed by the Tulare Indians, coming and warning them of an apparent attack on the mission. Without going into that story, the full explanation and the full legend of Pasquala can be found in Marie Walsh's book, on Mission Santa Inés, a mission of the passes. Okay. Let's see. Okay. We are now going to go back to the area of the seminary, and from there we will proceed towards the cemetery or Campo Santo of the Old Mission. As we go back to the cemetery area of the mission, we will go by this water riser here, and I would like to explain briefly about the water system that runs through here, so that if any major work ever needs to be done on the watering system, the source of the water will be available. The line that you see here is about, underneath this line are two 4-inch lines that come from the highway, which is 246 here to my right. They run on direct line to the highway to the city water meter. They run through here. As it passes here, one of the lines, which has been determined to be an irrigation line, this riser is attached to it, and from this riser, all the water that supplies the gardens in here is derived. On the other side, going through here is the other 4-inch line. It continues on through until we come out to the middle of the quadrangle, where it turns and goes down and to a water meter, which is located by the back gate to the mission, and that is strictly domestic water. Again, we are back at the seminary area, and we will now proceed towards the Campo Santo, or the mission's cemetery. As I approach the cemetery, I would like to draw your attention to two things. Number one is the arbor under which I will be walking, and secondly, a grotto to the honoring Our Lady of Lourdes. The arbor that is here dates to about 1978. But before that, there was an old grape arbor out here. We're not sure whether that was part of the mission period or not, but that was so badly decayed, and the grapes were so non-productive anymore, that in 1974, 78, this arbor was destroyed and a brand new one put up, and is a frequently used path as our visitors go to see the cemetery. But as I move along here, at the end of the arbor, we're going to come to a very interesting and historical, in its own way, piece of mission life. This is the grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes. It is not part of the original mission, but it was, it was constructed here in the late 1940s by a man named John Gebhardt, who was, we spoke of before, who was a person who worked on the dairies and came in here to help, and eventually came to live here at the mission. He had seen the movie, The Song of Bernadette, in the late 40s, and was quite impressed by the story of Our Lady of Lourdes. And so he, when he came here to the mission, it was always within his mind that he would build a grotto to Our Lady of Lourdes, fashioned somewhat on the original grotto in Lourdes in France. But the unique part of this grotto was that John was quite a penurious type of person. He, although he was quite wealthy in his own right, he was very slow to spend any money, and as a result he did two things here which make this shrine outstanding. Number one, every rock that you see in this shrine he drove up in his old Chevrolet, loaded in the trunk up on Figueroa Mountain, and brought down here with trunkfuls at a time. After having done that, instead of buying a few bags of concrete, he found a few bags of concrete out in Brother Alexis's carpenter shop, which was already hard and of no use. But John, in this particular case, made up his mind that he would reuse this concrete, and as a result, he took a sledgehammer and he broke and reconstituted all that concrete back so that it could be used here as a mortar in this grotto. It took him about 3 years to build this, but it is a very, very sturdy structure. Lined within it is wire and mesh and anything that would be needed to keep the arch strong and protected. You can also notice how thick the walls are here. When it was completed, he There was a lady that lived here in the parish. Her name was Lisa Andresen. She was married to the son of the man who owned Borgie Andresen, who owned the Danish inn at that particular time. She was an Austrian, Bavarian, just like John, and he asked her if she would be able to find a shrine in Europe, or a statue in Europe, to Our Lady of Lourdes, and that she did through her contacts, and this beautiful statue of Our Lady of Lourdes and Bernadette were the result of that. She obtained it for him, but this is the one place where John invested a great deal of his own personal funds in producing this grotto, especially the statues. We have had problems over the years with the candles within the grotto because they were carelessly placed there, and as a result, one time the statue of Bernadette received some serious burns from the candles, and as a result, we moved the candle stands to the outside. One of the very interesting things about this, and little known things about this statue, was that in 1974, when the gardens were being reestablished, Monsignor Hawks, who was also the chancellor of the archdiocese and overseeing this project for the archdiocese, determined that the grotto should not be here, that it should be taken down and either reconstructed somewhere else or be done away with. To this day, do not really understand his motivations in doing this, but the company that was doing the construction work here, J.T. Patrick Company, were given orders to take down the grotto and remove it. So on the morning that they were to do this, when I found out about it, I went down and I told old John, John, you ought to come up here because they're going to take your statues out. They're going to take down the grotto, and I don't know if they're going to restore it. Well, of course, John became very emotional and angry over this. And so I walked back into the garden. A few minutes later, John appeared at the far end of the garden down here with a shotgun. And at this particular place, about where I'm standing, the gentleman that was going to do the demolishing with a sledgehammer had the sledgehammer in hand and was almost ready to start hitting the rocks. He had not touched them yet. And at that particular point, John called out from him, and telling him that if he took that sledgehammer and even hit this grotto, that he would shoot him. And of course, this was enough of an intimidation to the worker to stand back. And when Father Roger became aware that what was going on here, he called Monsignor Hawks, and the project was left to be where it was. It was a very emotional day for everyone here, an emotional day, of course, for John Gebhardt, the builder of this grotto. From here, we are now going to walk out past the rear end of the Mission Church, which is here. And as we do go by, I want you to look up towards the roof. And as you look up at the roof, about 6-8 foot down from the ceiling, or from the actual roof of the mission, you are going to see the outlines of another building. And that outline is where the quadrangle took over on a one-story level and proceeded to the buttress that we saw here a few minutes ago. And it was in this area that there were the stables and the blacksmith shops, etc. But we can see the outlines of the original mission buildings which fell into decay. But it is quite interesting that in this area, the area I am standing in right at this very moment, where the Indian revolt had its worst day, it was at this part of the mission quadrangle that the fire was set that would eventually burn down this mission. However, the Chumash came to the rescue. The priests were holed up in this little room at the back of the mission, and the Chumash Indians came, put out the fire, and thus saved the mission on that day. And this, of course, is a great symbol of the fact and the denial of the quite often said that the Padres and the neophytes and the Chumash were abused by the Padres. The Padres of this mission were extremely held in in high esteem by the Chumash, and we have many, many stories of their affection and love of the Padres and the Chumash here. But this is one example how they came, rescued the Padres from death, and also from saved the mission from burning. We'll now go out into the cemetery and see this very historical part of our mission. We have arrived here in the Old Mission Cemetery. The first thing to note, mentally at least as far as this cemetery is concerned, is that it is divided into three parts. The first part, which is the far eastern section from the bell tower back down to the end buttress of the church, is a section in which the Chumash were buried during the mission period. And we are told that there could be up to 700 or 1,700 remains of Chumash here in the cemetery, in the Indian part of the cemetery. This is highly unlikely, but the mission records do show 1,700 deaths among the Chumash during the mission period here at Santa Inés. However, it is quite well known that the Chumash had a choice when passing away to be buried in their own individual ancient Chumash burial spots, or to be buried here at the Old Mission. Probably around 1,200 chose to be buried here in the grounds. Although it seems quite small, we must remember that at that particular time in history, as any part of the world, the child mortality rate was very high. So many of these graves, being very small, contain the remains of small Chumash children. The same is true of the area that comes from that last buttress to an area where we're now standing at this end of the by this cross here. This area was the burial ground for many of the local people who were also members of the Old Mission. And we have many of their names. At the present time, we are trying to do some research because many of the graves have crosses and were not marked. Many graves do not have any identification at all. So at the present time, we are working diligently to see if we can at least name the graves where there is a marker which has no identification on it. And perhaps in the process there, we will be able to eventually lay out the cemetery in a more uniform fashion. As we look along over towards this area here in the wall, this wall that you're looking at here, as far as the buttress is concerned, is not part of the cemetery wall historically. That wall was added when we redid the cemetery, the original cemetery wall of the mission. This was added in order to include the newer part of the cemetery, which was reserved for the settlers. There are an interesting number of markers here in the cemetery that we do have identification for. Many of them we don't much know the history of them, but we do have the names. This particular one here, which we'll show you a little bit later, dedicated to Isabel Alvarado. The family of Isabel are still living and quite often visit this grave. Moving over this way towards the wall, I find to be one of the most interesting of the later settler gravesites here in the mission. It is a family plot dedicated to the Newman family. And resting on this spot is the wife of Walter Newman and their baby that was born at childbirth, and next to it, one of their young children who died at a little bit later date. And I'll read to you what it says on these markers. We can probably move in a little quick. This gravesite is dedicated to the memory of Elizabeth A. Newman, the wife of J.W. Newman. We know very little about them except that they were settlers here in the very early times of the mission. You can see that Elizabeth died at the age of 30, and we presume that she died at childbirth because her son, Walter, is also buried with her in this grave. Immediately to the left of this monument is also another child of the Newmans who was 2 years old and 1 month and 26 days, as the markers say. This is all we know. They are recorded in the archives of the mission. We know nothing about the family at all, and we have no identification or marker or archival reference to whatever happened to J.W. Newman, the husband of Elizabeth. But it might be quite well to notice and it may not be able to be viewed by camera, but across the top of this cross, which we have just recently had restored, is written the words, "Noble Lizzie." And this is that's what makes this monument quite so interesting, because it does reflect the devotion that Mr. Newman had towards his wife Elizabeth, and he left this memory of that dedication to her in the inscription that he has on the cross. But and it's also noticed that on this monument down here that in the old tradition that this was not just Elizabeth's child, but this was our baby. So it identifies the family feeling there and shows the dedication of this family. As we move along the wall, we're going to pass a number of family grave sites. This is a family grave site for the Ortega family. We don't know, at the present time, we know very little about them. We know the names of at least 4 of the people that are buried in this family site. We don't know at this present time, but we hope to in the present to be more specific as to how many sites are actually in this. The same thing as we move further up along the wall, we are going to come to a family plot. And as you will notice, that these are generally 4-sided monuments. And that is generally the case what happens in the death of children. So we presume both at the Ortega and the Lopez sites that these were, reading the markers on there, that these children were anywhere from 1 to 3 or 4 years old. So generally the family would just put a marker there identifying the resting grounds of their children. But also this family here does have some adults that are buried here. We do have the remnants of an early cross, which identifies the person on that cross as Pete Lopez. These grave sites, as we said before, this is the grave site of Pete Lopez. Now, as you will notice, quite an interesting thing, this was a very popular type of marker at the turn of the century, the use of seashells in a plaster mold, and also a picture of the person who was buried here was also encased in this area. Of course, a thing of that particular nature has a very short life, and the pictures have disappeared quite some time ago. Here is another Lopez Lopez gravesite, and it also can see where the picture was. It's a piece of glass over there, but at the present time we're not able to go through and find out what that picture was. The names of the person that was buried here, we know that it is a Lopez, but we do not know who it particularly was. And this particular marker here is dedicated to G. Lopez, and we don't know any more than that. I did some restoration on this marker because it was broken and was just laying here during the last year. As we move across the cemetery, we'll move up to another family plot, which again holds the remains of children. And that is the Dominguez site. It is, we know very little about this Dominguez family. We don't seem to be able to track any present people here in the valley with this name. It is the Dominguez. But both of these are children. One was born in 1890 and died in 1890. That is Refugio. And in this gravesite is the remains of Daniel, who also died before he reached the age of 1. So as we said before, many of the gravesites, both for the early settlers and for the Chumash also, were gravesites of children because of the high mortality rate in those times and the rough, difficult life that was lived here in the early days. This is also a gravesite of a very old family here in the valley, and members of this family still live here in the Santa Inés Valley. This is the gravesite of Mrs. Julia B. Franzina, and this lady was the mother of Palmyra Murphy, who is one of the very old parishioners here. She died at 102 a number of years ago, but 2 of her daughters still live here in the mission. And the family does still come, as you can see, and occasionally put a little flower marker by the mission. But she died again, as many people did here at a very early age. Julia died at the age of 37 years and 6 months. But her family is still here. They still look after and tend to the grave. Moving a little bit over here, we'll probably see the last burial that took place here in the mission in the visitors section, and that is the resting place of Pedro Pico, and he was buried here in 1938, and he is also a member of the armed services, and his grave is always marked on Memorial Day as the soldiers of the wars are remembered here in the Mission Cemetery. The marker that is here is not a marker that belongs within the cemetery, but it was brought here by some visitor at one time who found this marker down by the grist mill. And in order to keep it from being lost or stuff, I placed it here at the mission. And I just wanted to be noted that this is not the marker that belongs here in the cemetery, but it is a way to keep it and preserve it until there's some way we can determine whose marker this would be and perhaps where it came from. But it is of the mission period because we notice that it is sandstone. And this was a type of marker we could see that scattered to the cemetery, which was quite often used here in those days because of the easy way that it could be carved and formed. But the durability, of course, was very poor.